on the night of the 20th of March, 1939, in the courtyard of the Berlin Fire Brigade's main station. A regime that controlled the most cultured nation in Europe lined up roughly 5,000 paintings, drawings, and sculptures. Then they set them on fire. Works by Paul Klee, by Max Beckmann, by Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, by Otto Dix, some of the most important art of the 20th century, fed into the flames not by accident, not in the chaos of war, but on purpose in peacetime. As a training exercise, firemen practiced their hoses on a bonfire of masterpieces, and the men who ordered it called it a cleansing. How does a country produce a fire like that? Not a mob, not a riot, a government. 2 years earlier, that same government had done something even stranger. It built an art exhibition, carefully designed, professionally hung, heavily promoted, for the sole purpose of teaching an entire nation to despise the paintings inside it. They hung the art crooked on purpose. They scrawled insults on the walls in the artist's own gallery. They packed in over 2 million visitors. It remains, to this day, the most attended exhibition of modern art ever staged, and it was engineered from the first nail as a weapon. Before we get to the fire, we have to understand the word Entartet Kunst, in English, degenerate art. The word entartet, degenerate, did not start in the art world. It came out of 19th century pseudoscience, out of a poisonous strain of thinking that treated entire categories of human beings as biologically diseased. A writer named Max Nordau had used it decades earlier to attack modern artists as mentally and physically sick. The Nazis took that idea and turned it into state policy. To them, modern art was not simply ugly or difficult or unpopular. It was in their telling evidence of racial and mental decay, proof that the German soul was being corrupted from within. Now, here is the part that tells you everything. The art they decided to destroy was not obscure. It was not fringe. Expressionism, Cubism, Dada, Surrealism, the Bauhaus, the New Objectivity. These were the movements that had made Germany the undisputed center of modern art in the 9,920 seconds. Berlin in the Weimar years was the most creatively alive city on the planet. German museums, many of them led by visionary directors, had been buying this work aggressively, building the greatest public collections of modern art anywhere in the world. So when the regime came for degenerate art, it was not raiding the margins, it was looting the crown jewels of its own museums. Why would a government attack the very thing that made its culture the envy of the world? Because to a totalitarian state, ambiguity is the enemy. Modern art asks questions. It distorts. It refuses to flatter power. It shows the world as fractured, anxious, strange, which is to say, it shows the world as it actually felt to the people who had just survived the First World War. A dictatorship cannot tolerate that. It needs art that gives orders, not art that asks questions. So it set out to erase an entire way of seeing. At the center of this stands a failed painter. You already know who. Twice he applied to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna to become a painter. Twice he was rejected. The examiners told him his work showed too little aptitude for painting and suggested he try architecture instead. Hold that detail in your mind. A man humiliated by an art academy who would one day hold the power to put art academies to the torch. I am not going to pretend the entire history of 20th century art was steered by one man's wounded ego. That would be too neat. But it would also be dishonest to ignore that the person who declared war on modern painting was someone who had wanted, more than almost anything, to be a painter himself and had been told he was not good enough. His taste in art was rigid and sentimental. He loved 19th century academic realism, heroic nudes, idealized landscapes, blonde peasants in golden fields, marble gods. Beauty to him meant order, symmetry, and racial idealization. Anything that departed from that was, by definition, sickness. And once he had a state behind him, his personal taste stopped being an opinion. It became law. In 1933, within months of taking power, the regime began purging degenerate professors from art academies, shutting down the Bauhaus, and removing modern works from museum walls. But the masterstroke, the moment they decided not just to hide the art, but to put it on trial in front of the public, came in the summer of 1937. In July 1937, in Munich, the regime opened not one exhibition, but two. and the whole design depended on you seeing them as a pair. The first was the Great German Art Exhibition. It opened in a brand new purpose-built marble temple called the House of German Art, the first monumental building the regime ever commissioned. Inside, on spacious walls perfectly lit, were the paintings the regime wanted Germans to love: heroic soldiers, nude Aryan athletes, wholesome mothers, idealized farmland. This was the official answer to the question, what should German art look like? It was, by almost any honest measure, mediocre, technically competent, emotionally dead, drowning in kitsch. The second exhibition opened the very next day, a short walk away, in cramped, badly lit rooms in the old Hofgarten arcade. This was Intartik Kunst, the degenerate art show, and everything about it was staged to disgust. Around 650 works, ripped from the walls of 32 German museums, were crammed together edge to edge. Some were hung without frames, some were tilted, some were jammed so close they overlap. On the walls, painted in crude lettering, were jeering slogans. Madness becomes method, an insult to German womanhood. Nature as seen by sick minds. Next to many works, the curators chalked up the prices the museums had paid for them, always in the inflated currency of the hyperinflation years, deliberately, to make the public believe vast sums of taxpayer money had been squandered on garbage. Think about how clever and how cruel that staging is. You were not asked to look at the art. You were told before you looked that it was made by lunatics, by frauds, by enemies of the nation, and that it had robbed you personally. The deck was stacked at the door, and it worked. Over the course of its run, the degenerate art exhibition drew more than 2 million visitors. By the time it finished touring 12 more German and Austrian cities, the total approached 3.5 million. The official German art temple next door, with its approved masterpieces, drew a fraction of that crowd. People did not line up to be uplifted. They lined up to sneer. The regime had discovered that contempt is a more powerful draw than admiration. Now, let me tell you whose work was on those walls, so the loss is not an abstraction. Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, a founder of German Expressionism, a man whose jagged street scenes captured the electric anxiety of the modern city like no one before him. More than 600 of his works were seized from German museums. In 1938, isolated in Switzerland, his life's reputation branded as degenerate by his own country, Kirchner shot himself. The exhibition did not just burn paintings. In his case, it helped kill the painter. Emil Nolde is the most bitter irony of all. Nolde was, himself, a Nazi party member. He believed in the regime. He thought of his own art as profoundly, spiritually German. It did not matter. Over 1,000 of his works were confiscated, more than any other single artist. He was eventually forbidden to paint at all, reduced to making tiny secret watercolors he called the unpainted pictures, hiding them from the very state he had supported. If you want to understand how indiscriminate this machine was, remember that it devoured one of its own believers. Max Beckmann left Germany the day after the exhibition opened and never returned. Paul Klee, dismissed from his teaching post, fled to Switzerland, his health already failing. Otto Dix, whose unflinching paintings of crippled First World War veterans were exactly the kind of truth the regime could not stand, was forbidden to exhibit and retreated into internal exile. George Grass had already seen what was coming and got out to America. Wassily Kandinsky, Mark Chagall, Oskar Kokoschka, names that today anchor the collections of every great museum on Earth, were all on those walls labeled as the sick products of a diseased culture. Roughly 112 artists, around 650 works in the show itself. But the show was only the storefront. Behind it came the warehouse. In the summer of 1937, the regime gave a commission sweeping legal authority to walk into any German public museum and remove anything it deemed degenerate. No compensation, no appeal. They were not gentle, and they were not slow. Over the following months, that commission stripped roughly 20,000 works of art from more than 100 German museums: paintings, sculptures, prints, drawings, watercolors. These were not seized from private enemies of the state. They were seized from the German public itself. Works the public had bought through their museums for their own cities. The regime stole a nation's art from the nation, and then it faced a problem that exposes the whole grubby truth underneath the ideology. What do you do with 20,000 objects you have just declared worthless? Here is the answer that gives the lie to everything they said. If this art was truly garbage, truly the diseased scribblings of madmen, you would expect them to destroy all of it. They did not, because the moment they had it in the warehouse, the regime realized that the rest of the world, the museums and dealers and collectors of Switzerland, France, Britain, and America, considered this garbage to be priceless. And the regime needed foreign currency. It needed hard cash to fund rearmament. So the same government that publicly spat on this art quietly set up an operation to sell the best of it abroad for as much money as it could squeeze out. They despised it in the newspapers and monetized it in the back room. The contempt was for the public, the profit was for them. In June 1939, in the Grand Hotel National in the Swiss city of Lucerne, a respected auction house called the Galerie Fischer held a sale. On the block, 126 paintings and sculptures handpicked from the confiscated trove: Van Gogh, Picasso, Matisse, Gauguin, Braque, Klee. All of it stolen from German museums, all of it sold for the regime's benefit. Collectors and museums faced an agonizing choice. If you bought a painting, you were rescuing a masterpiece from a regime that might otherwise destroy it, but you were also handing that regime exactly the foreign cash it wanted and rewarding the theft. Some buyers stayed away in protest. Others decided that saving the art mattered more and bought. A self-portrait by Van Gogh went under the hammer that day and is now one of the treasures of an American museum, saved, in a sense, by the very sale that should never have happened. The auction was a grim success for the regime. It generated a substantial sum in hard currency. The line between rescue and complicity has rarely been blurrier than in that hotel ballroom. But the works that could not be sold, the thousands the dealers did not want, or that the regime could not be bothered to market, had to be disposed of, and here we return to where we began. On the 20th of March, 1939, in the courtyard of the Berlin main fire station, the regime burned them. The figure most often cited is roughly 5,000 paintings, drawings, watercolors, and graphic works, plus thousands more on paper, consumed in a single operation. Some accounts describe it explicitly as a fire brigade exercise, the destruction of a nation's modern art reduced to a practical drill, a way to test the hoses. Imagine the men standing in that courtyard. Some of them must have known what was burning. Most likely, that did not slow a single hand. We do not have a complete photographic record of that night. We do not have a roll call of exactly which canvases went into the flames. And that absence is itself part of the crime. When a painting is stolen, there is at least a hope of recovery. When a painting is burned without record, it does not just leave the world, it leaves the memory of the world. We can name the artists. We often cannot name the specific paintings because the works that would tell us what was lost are the very works that were destroyed. So how much was lost forever and how much slipped through? The honest answer is that we are still counting 80 years later. Scholars have spent decades reconstructing the confiscation from the regime's own meticulous inventory ledgers. Because, in a final dark irony, the bureaucrats who looted the museums kept careful lists. From those ledgers, we know roughly 20,000 works were taken. We can trace where many of them ended up in foreign museums in private hands, scattered across the world, by the Lucerne sale and the backroom deals. But against a great many entries in those ledgers sits a single German word: Verschollen, lost. Whereabouts unknown. Some of those are works we know were burned, but some are simply gone. Not confirmed destroyed, not located, just vanished into the chaos of the war and its aftermath. And that is where the story stops being only a tragedy and becomes also a hunt. In 2012, in a quiet apartment in Munich, German customs investigators stumbled onto something extraordinary. The son of one of the regime's own approved art dealers had been living for decades alongside a hoard of more than 1,000 works of art, many of them precisely the kind of modern pieces that had been confiscated and condemned in 1937. Beckmann, Chagall, Dix, pieces the world had assumed were lost. One quiet old man, one ordinary flat, and inside it a buried fragment of the very catastrophe we have been describing. The discovery set off a years-long legal and moral struggle over who the rightful owners were, and over how many more such caches might be sitting unsuspected behind ordinary doors. So when you hear that a painting was lost in the degenerate art purge, do not assume it is ash. Some of it is, but some of it was sold, hidden, smuggled, inherited, forgotten in an attic, mislabeled in a provincial collection. Somewhere, and this is not fantasy, it has already happened more than once. A canvas pulled off a German museum wall in '93, the 7th of May, still be leaning in the dark of a house whose owners have no idea what they are sitting on. The fire took thousands of works, but it did not take all of them. And the survivors are still surfacing, one improbable discovery at a time. Here is my own view for what it is worth. The degenerate art exhibition is usually remembered as a story about taste, a Philistine regime that could not appreciate modern painting. That reading is too comfortable, and it is wrong. They understood modern art perfectly. That is precisely why they feared it. They knew that art which asks questions, which shows the world as fractured and human and unresolved, is the natural enemy of any power that demands a single, obedient way of seeing. So they did not merely censor it, they tried to teach a whole nation to do the censoring for them. To laugh, to sneer, to feel personally robbed until contempt for the art felt like the people's own idea rather than the state's command. 2 million people walked through that show. The regime's deepest victory was not the bonfire. It was persuading ordinary citizens to despise their own culture on cue. The paintings that burned in Berlin can never come back, but the warning in this story is not really about the past. It is about how easily a society can be taught to hate the very things that make it free. If you want to keep walking through the dangerous, contested, and unforgettable corners of art history with me, the forgeries, the thefts, the masterpieces hidden behind walls, and the ones that vanished into fire, subscribe and stay with the channel. There is always another painting with a secret, and we are only just getting started.